Hey everybody, it's EJ Hassenfratz here, aka iDesign. And for those of you who may not be familiar with me or what I do, basically I've been doing tutorials and teaching Cinema 4D for like the past 7 or 8 years. And been using Cinema 4D even longer than that. Well, right now I've joined up with School of Motion as a creative director, and it's been awesome. Basically, if you're not familiar with School of Motion, what we do over there is we're trying to change the way art school is. We're trying to make it available to anybody in the world, no matter where you are or how much time you have available. If you want to learn motion design, take your career to the next level, basically we got you. So if you're not familiar with School of Motion, go over there, check it out. We're doing a lot of Cinema 4D training. We even have a new Cinema 4D course taught by yours truly. I already have one already called Cinema 4D Basecamp. So just to say that if you're trying to take the next step in your career, come check out School of Motion. Got a lot of free content over there as well. But basically what I'm here today is to basically show you the awesome new features in the new version of Cinema 4D S22. It's really exciting that Maxon kind of dropped this on us, and I'm very fortunate to be a part of this and have the opportunity to share all these new features with you. It's something that I really love to do is teaching people that 3D is not hard. It doesn't have to be hard, right? And that's kind of the reason why I got into teaching Cinema 4D to begin with, because I know what it's like to be a complete novice or be completely intimidated by the thought of learning 3D. But Cinema 4D, and why I love it, is that it makes 3D so accessible. And with this new release, with S22, it takes that philosophy of making everything approachable and applies that to the world of UVs. Now, if you're like me, you've probably avoided UVs for most of your career. Well, hopefully that changes with this new workflow, because it's never been easier to A, learn about UVs, and B, start applying a UV workflow to your own work. So that's what I'm going to be covering today, as well as covering some Redshift. So Redshift, I feel like, is one of those things that also might be intimidating to some people because it is node-based, and a lot of people might be afraid of nodes. So I'm here to tell you that it's okay. Embrace the nodes. Redshift, really the way it works is very similar to physical renderers. So if you're used to the built-in physical renderer, a lot of those universal rendering concepts translate over. So that's what I'm going to be covering today as well. So the new UVs, some of the new features of S22, and a little bit of Redshift. Let's go ahead and hop in. All right, on to the juicy stuff. S22 is headlined by UV workflow improvements, and rightly so. It's not only been one of the most requested features users wanted to improve for years and years and years and years and years and years and years, but it's also been one of the most painful to use areas in an app that really prides itself on its ease of use. And I'm sure I'm not alone when I say that up until now, I've totally avoided UVs in C4D altogether. So for those that may not be familiar, let's begin by answering the question, what's a UV? Well, UVs are the names of the axes of a plane. You can see that in our two views here, our texture UV editor and our normal 3D view, we have the X, Y, and Z coordinates that are, of course, used for coordinates in 3D space, and UVs are basically the names of the axes of a 2D plane or a polygon. Now, how do you get a 3D object into a 2D UV? Well, UV unwrapping is the process of flattening out a 3D model into a 2D representation for texture mapping. So if you think of a stuffed animal, like this stuffed animal whale here, it's made by sewing together separated pieces of flat fabric based on a sewing pattern to create one sewn together stuffed animal, this happy little whale. And basically UVing is that same process of basically defining seams and then unsewing or unwrapping a model at its seams to flatten it out to, again, easily texture. Now, S22 greatly improves this entire UV unwrapping process, especially for noobs. It allows newcomers to easily understand and visualize the UV process and how 2D UVs actually relate to our 3D model. So here we have UV the whale. Took me a long time to come up with that name. And what we're going to do is unwrap him like the stuffed animal whale so I can show you the similarities to that whole sewing process. So to start editing the UVs, or to even view the UVs, we're going to head into our body paint UV edit layout. Now, the first thing you're going to notice is that number one, the layout isn't completely jumbled. If you've used body paint in the past, the menus were all over the place. The object manager wasn't here. The attribute manager wasn't here. Left was right, up was down. It was a little bit confusing to say the least. So this is really nice that everything kind of stays in a kind of typical standard Cinema 4D layout, so you're not trying to figure out where things are. So that being said, let's go ahead and view our UV. So here's my UV editor. If I go and use the 1 key and 2 key, I can pan and zoom just like in my perspective view here. And to view the UVs, I'm just going to go ahead and select my object. And what I can do is then select the edge mode. And you're going to notice that I can actually select an edge in my 3D view, and you can see in the 2D view what edge is represented there. So it's so easy to see the relationship between your 2D view and your 3D view. Like I can select all this stuff. I can do a UL loop selection, and you can see there's the loop selection selected there in the UV editor. Now, one thing you can see is if I get out of my selection here, is you can easily see the seams on your 3D object. So you can see this relationship. Here's this seam highlighted here, and this is that seam on our 3D model. And you can see here's if I click on it, you can see that's the fin, and here's that seam visualized right there on our 3D model. So this actually allows you to have UVs kind of click as far as what they are and how they relate to your model, because you can easily select all these edges and polygons, and that is selected in your view. You can even select things in your UV editor and it will select it in your 3D view. So you can see that direct relationship with your model in 3D and in 2D space. So there's a lot of different visual representations of how you can view your UVs. So if we go into the view menu here, you can see we're in that UV seams. We can also choose something like multicolor islands, and wow, we just got really tropical here. It's a tropical whale, and you can see that this UV island, so individual groups of UVs are called an island, and you can see that on our whale, this pink island is right there. You can see that represented in our 3D view. Here's our yellow UV island here. You can see that's different color there. And then on the other side, there's our other fin, our other flapper. And then right here, that's orange. Okay, so we have this visual representation, this color-coded UV island mode. Let's go ahead and let's try another one. Let's do distortion. And distortion is very interesting because it shows you the distortion of your polygons via a heat map, with blue being your UVs, your polygons are stretched, and red meaning that your UVs are actually squashed. And you can easily see if you have any overlapping polygons as well if we go into that view. Okay, so another way to check distortion is by utilizing a UV map. So if we go to configure, I'm going to go to this back tab here, and right now the texture is just empty, but we can load in a UV map, and you can see that it's going to apply a UV map, and you can see the distortion on your model and see how well your model is wrapped. For not knowing anything about unwrapping, I think, I did an okay job. I don't know. But you can also adjust the opacity here, and you can also load your own UV map as well. Okay, so I'm just going to turn that to UV canvas. So now that you have a better idea of what AUV is and a little bit about what unwrapping is, let's cover the new unwrapping workflows in S22. So there's a new unwrapping algorithm, and it's actually implemented in this set UV from projection. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to delete my current UV tag here to just blow that whole UV unwrap away. And basically what you can do is you can set UV from projection by just clicking that button. I'm just going to go Command or Control Z to undo that. And we can actually click on this gear and choose a starting projection type. So we can choose flat, our good friend cubic, use that a ton. But what you can typically do is just kind of do like a frontal projection, and you kind of want to have your model kind of flat on, kind of like that. And we'll go into just frontal and click OK. And you can see that we're using this current view in our perspective view. From here, we can go into the automatic UV tab and utilize the new packed option. So I'll just click apply and boom, we automatically have our whale. UV the whale is cut and unsewn by all these different seams here. Now it's not perfect, but if you need a quick and dirty UV map, this is usable, right? With a single click of a button. So this auto unwrapping is great for beginner users who just need a good UV map. All this to say is I can probably go beyond my old go-to method of UV mapping called let's try cubic and cross our fingers. Now I'll talk a little bit more about how useful this automatic UV algorithm is and how it's great for exporting to game engines and AR apps a little later on. Now for those of you who want to get your hands a little dirty with unwrapping your own UVs, S22 has a way easier and iterative workflow for unwrapping UVs. So let's just go ahead and delete this UVW tag and let's go into edge mode, because the way to UV unwrap is you need to first define your seams via edge selections. Now, seams are basically like making cuts. It's the reverse of sewing, where instead of stitching your patterns together, you need to try to figure out where on your model are the best areas to try to cut your model using these edge selections and be able to flatten out your 3D model into those little sewing pattern pieces or UV maps, those 2D UV maps. So this is actually way easier to do now with the improved selection tools in S22. So things like the loop selection, if I go and grab my loop selection by hitting U and then L, you can see that no longer do you have that boundary edge option here, because the loop selection tool automatically stops at boundary edges now. So what I can do is kind of select right here, grab this loop selection, and to cut this, all I got to do is click on UV unwrap, and you can see we just sliced UV the whale into pieces. Okay, so the great part about this is we can continue adding cuts and seams and kind of experimenting and seeing what is the best way to unwrap our model. So let's just say we want to then unwrap the fin. So I'll grab this selection, and we'll grab the improved path selection tool by hitting U and then M. If you ever forget what it is, just think That's the dad joke quota filled for the day. And I'm just going to select this path. Okay, so the loop selection, held down the shift key to add the selection, grab this path. Now what we need to do is then mirror this on the other side, and in previous versions you'd have to do this manually, but in S22 there's this new mirror selection tool which saves you so much time. If you just click this, you can see we just mirrored that selection on the left fin, or I guess the right fin if it's the UV, the whale view, and then we can just go ahead and do UV unwrap, and there's those two fins on their separate UV islands. Now we can also maybe try out some different cuts. Maybe we want to try out if we can, cut the tail here. Let's just do this, and then we'll mirror that and UV unwrap, and now we just got a giant hole in our fin. So that was not a smooth move, so I'll just undo that, and that's fine. And this is the great part about this, is we can kind of experiment and audition different cuts to see what's the best way to unwrap our model. Now another cool feature is you can go ahead and select edges directly in your view and see where they're at on your 2D UV view. And you can say UV weld and relax. Now this is a new feature that you can go ahead and iteratively UV weld and relax and kind of stitch different edges together and combine them together. You see we have a little bit of overlapping UVs there. So I'll just go ahead and Command or Control Z to undo that. But just to say that this new UV weld and relax is a new feature that, again, drastically speeds up your workflow. You can weld together as many edges as you want, seams as you want. And again, it's part of this whole new iterative way to work. Now, once you're done unwrapping your UVs, you can then utilize some of the new UV packing algorithms that have been added into S22, namely the rasterized and geometric. Now, what UV packing allows you to do is realign your UV islands here and optimize them to fill up your UV space. So I can just go ahead and choose this geometric, hit apply, and you can see that this fills up the space much better and kind of clumps these objects together so we can add more islands into this. And if we ever needed to adjust any of these islands after the fact, it's very easy to do that. You can just go into polygon mode and double click to be able to easily select an island and bring up your UV transform tool or Command T, and you can easily just grab and rotate and scale your islands and reposition them any way you would like. And this is helpful also when you bring up the UV map as well. So you can position these islands to look correctly on your UV map. Now, all of these UV features altogether dramatically improves and speeds up the whole UV unwrapping process. And added bonus, Maxon announced that they're going to continue working on improving these UV workflows and much more for a release later this year. Let's move on to the new future Viewport. Now, the Viewport's been progressively updated to look way more visually pleasing. And in S22, Maxon's removed the strong dependency on OpenGL. And on Mac, they've actually moved to supporting Apple Metal. So what are the benefits of this new Viewport, you may ask? Well, for one, the new Viewport calculates multi-instances much faster. Using Calculate FPFs, we can actually see the difference between scenes in the old Viewport versus the new Viewport. And you can just see how much faster, it's crazy fast, to be able to navigate a very massive big scene with a lot of clones and navigate it really fast compared to R21. It's pretty amazing how much faster it is. With this new Viewport, hair also looks much better using the hair object hairlines display with accurate CPU material and enhanced shading activated. Fortunately, does not cure baldness. And the Viewport filter options have been reorganized and can now be saved as presets. So you can save different presets for different workflows. And there's also the new geometry only mode. So you can actually check out your scene without any of that clutter, Marie Kondo your scene, and render out a quick play blast with only your geometry visible using Viewport render. There's also a new Viewport downres, so you can tame heavier scenes that way as well. Over the past couple releases, the modeling commands have been slowly being migrated to the new modeling core, and with S22, this migration's basically done. This means that you have better selection tools with more reliable results, as I showed you in the UV workflow. It's got better vertex maps, and bevels have been given a speed boost, and they also have better preserved UVs, to name a few benefits. Another thing is that the magnet tool and brush tool have been upgraded to share a lot of the same features. And one of my favorite tools that really helps cover up my horrible modeling skills, the iron tool, now respects boundary edges so you can iron with more control. Now, if you've never used the iron tool before, holy cow. This is like a modeler's best friend, especially a noob modeler's best friend. It helps iron out all your janky geometry that you may be building and kind of cover up your shortcomings. And it actually helped me a lot modeling UV the whale, as you can see here. Now, this next feature is going to get people who work with game engines or AR and VR really excited, because with Cinema 4D S22, there's a new GLTF exporter. Now, this was previously available via Maxon Labs, but it's built in now, which is awesome. If you're not familiar with GLTF, GLTF is a common 3D file format compatible with game engines and AR and VR apps like one of my favorites, Adobe Aero. And it's called the JPEG of 3D because of its efficiency. And it's great for 3D product visualizations for websites and a lot of other applications. Now, in Cinema 4D, if you want to export out as GLTF, just go to File, Export, and navigate to GLTF. Now, this has a lot more settings and a lot more compatibility than like FBX or even OBJ for a lot of these, game engines and stuff like that. And the settings are pretty straightforward. You have two file formats to choose from, the GLTF version and the binary version. I've noticed that some websites and some apps like Adobe Aero prefer the binary version of this file format. So just so you know, both of them are in here. It can support animation. So position, scale, rotation, animation, keyframed animation. It also supports certain types of morphs like pose morph and any morphing PLA animation. Unfortunately, it doesn't support like baked point cache or anything like that. Basically, you really have to just deal with morphing PLA animation. It also supports skin, which is perfect for our little koala here that is rigged with Mixamo and has all of its animation driven by keyframes and skin deformers. So that is supported. That's great for anyone who is into animating 3D characters. There's one thing to keep in mind when exporting out joint or skin animation is that a lot of apps only support a certain amount of weights assigned to a single vertice. So for apps like, say, Adobe Aero, you can only have a vertices have 4 weights assigned to it by 4 separate joints. So one thing you want to do is when you are exporting out your character animation is to check your weights and see how many weights are influencing a single vertice. And one way you can do that is by double clicking your weight tag on your object and then just hovering over all of the vertices, and you can see how many vertices are kind of influencing here. So if you had an app that only supported 4 vertices, you can see that all of these, or most of these vertices have more than that 4. Now, if the app happens to support 6 or up to 6, then you're good then. So always pay attention to the app that you are exporting to and see what those limitations are because they do vary. Now let's move on to textures where there's a few things to keep in mind when exporting out using GLTF. Now, if you're using shaders like noise or tiles, or you're using polygon selections or anything like that, you need to make sure that you're baking out those textures and exporting out a UV. And in previous versions of Cinema 4D, this would actually be a pain, but this is where a new bake UVs function that actually utilizes that new auto UV algorithm that I talked about earlier comes in handy. This baking method is perfect for situations where you just need a quick and dirty UV map to help you export models with textures intact to game engines or AR or VR applications. So here I have my UV the whale, and I've textured this guy using a bunch of different methods. I have this texture here, right here, that's a polygon selection. I have this just base blue material. I have a material that's actually utilizing a vertex map. You can see right here, this little baleen, I don't know what the underbelly with that thing is utilizing some noise, and I'm utilizing an alpha that is coming from a vertex map to just kind of mask out the noise to just a certain part of the object of our character here. And then I also have just some flat map projection spots that, this is that cross your fingers and choose cubic kind of deal. And this is, your old janky way of just cobbling together a bunch of textures and mapping them using different projection methods. And, if you just save this out, you'd have no way to translate this to GLTF and export this out to another app. But now that we have the new baking method, we can easily do this and combine all of these different map textures into one image texture that we can export out. So to do that, we're going to select the object we want to bake out. We are going to go to Object, and we're going to choose Bake Object. Now, the one thing we need to keep in mind is we do not want to keep UVs, because what this Bake Object command is going to do if we have this unchecked is use that auto UV algorithm and create one for us automatically. So I'm going to choose Replace Objects, and we'll just have this be a single texture. Let's do maybe 2K here. And we can just choose whatever format we want, and we'll bake. You'll see there is that auto UV that was just created. If we hop on over to our body paint UV edit, you can see that even though we had no UV before, that baking command just helped us out and made one for us, which is really cool. So now we have the single image texture that we can now export out via GLTF. And one of the things you're probably yelling at me through your monitor about is all of this weird janky stuff. Like, what's going on? If I render this, we have all these smudges. It's like UV the whale got into some magic markers and just went to town on his face. Now, the problem with this isn't actually having anything to do with the UV unwrapping. It's all about the fact that we're using a subdivision surface here to subdivide our model after the UVs are applied. Now, typically, you could just bake the SDS in and then do that bake, the bake object option. You won't run into this issue, but since we baked the base geometry and we're subdividing it, we have to pay attention to this subdivide UVs option, because it's actually how the subdivision surface is handling the UV. Okay, so right now edge is no bueno. It's not working well at all. We're getting those smudges. So what we need to do is just change this from edge to boundary, and you'll see in our viewport that updated. If we render this, voila, it looks fine. And the only problem now is the fact that in our viewport, we know this renders fine, but in our viewport, it looks like garbage. We have all these weird seams. Now, if we want to improve that and actually get rid of all these seams in our viewport, all we got to do is go into our material that has that baked out texture. Just go into the viewport options, and for texture preview size, just go to no scaling, and we'll see the full res version of our texture applied to a model. And it's looking nice, looking good. No more seams, no garbage lines. So we can render that, and we're good to go there too. Okay, so we just needed to change that one thing in the subdivide UVs. We basically generated a UV map, baked it out, and baked all our textures with a single click of a button essentially. And now we're ready to go ahead and export this out via GLTF to use in game engines or any AR VR apps like Adobe Aero. So we'll go to Export, GLTF. And the only thing we need to worry about here is, of course, that we have textures enabled. And we also need to make sure that we have UVs enabled too, because remember, we generated UVs that are then applying this texture, mapping this texture to our geometry. So we need to make sure we're exporting those as well. And all these other optional items are fine to just leave checked on. I'll just click OK. And you're going to bake a GLTF temp, and that's just temporary. It'll actually export out a actual GLTF file, and voila, we're ready to go. Now all you have to do is just navigate to a website that supports GLTF, that you can test this out in a web browser like sandbox.babylonjs.com, and simply drag and drop your GLTF file into the browser window, and voila, there's UV the whale. And we can change the type of lighting in our view. And I mean, this is what's really cool about GLTF, is you can easily take your models from Cinema 4D, export them out into GLTF format, and start rocking and rolling in the world of AR or VR, and even play around with things like Adobe Aero and getting your characters in there. And it's just really cool to see your work outside of a computer monitor in like an iPhone or something like that. All right, so that just covers a little bit of like the heavy hitting new features in S22. If you want to learn more about all that stuff, definitely check out the Maxon website. They're going to have a detailed list of all of the features, even the small ones that I didn't cover in this presentation. Let's go into Redshift land. And my goal is going to be for anyone out there that's been intimidated by using Redshift because of nodes or anything else, is to make this Redshift look very approachable. And what I always like to say is that Redshift actually shares a lot of similarities with the physical render, a lot of the same concepts. And you know, if you learn the universal rendering concepts, everything's going to make a lot of sense because it uses all the same terminology. All right, so let's go ahead and let's just fire up the Redshift render view. You can find it right here, but I just have this already fired up and docked into my layout. So I'm going to fire this up by hitting the little play button here. Boom. And we should see just a horrible unlit objects here. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's just first start adding some lights. And you can see how quick that is to, this is like interactive render region on steroids, basically, if you're unfamiliar with third-party renderers. Okay, so always getting a live update of what this render is going to look like. So let's go and add some lights. Now, in every third-party render, you have to use their specific lights that have that render's specific light setting. So you can see under the lights, all of these lights should sound very familiar. Infinite, point, spot, area. These are the same lights in Cinema 4D, right? So we should know when to use what. So area lights, that's always my go-to. So I'm just going to grab an area light. And one of the things look how fast that updates, by the way. I'm just going to rotate this. One of the things I love about the Redshift light is that you can actually see with this little outline which direction the light's facing without having to just kind of see which direction the positive Z is facing. So boom, there's a light right there. There is a light and it doesn't go out. And we're going to also use a target light. So to grab a target light, we're just going to go to the Redshift area light. We're going to just scoot on over here and we're going to click this button and say add target tag and null. So that's going to, I already had one in there. I'm just going to delete that. But here's our null, and if I move this to the middle of our composition here, you can see that we basically have our target light in Redshift. So very easy stuff. And if we go into our lights options here in the attribute manager, you can see all the similar types of features in the general tab of a Cinema 4D light. So we have color. We can also use temperature. So this is similar to what we have in Octane, where you can do the temperature or just choose a color. Let's choose... no one does pink. Let's do pink. It takes a man to do a pink light, I think. And we're just going to go down to change this, the intensity. So we have intensity multiplier, and then we have the exposure, which is basically like your f-stop. I'm just going to right click on this up and down arrow to bring that back to its default. And basically we can scale this light up and do whatever we want here with this light. And the great part about this is that if you're not good at lighting, and one of the major reasons why you were bad at lighting is because you couldn't get this, really fast feedback, and you just got sick of trying to, move a light and hit render, wait a minute, and be like, actually, no, that doesn't look good. I'll move it this way. Let's hit render. And you just kind of, lighting just kind of slips by. At least it did for me for a long time, but it's just so easier to really learn more about lighting and try out and audition different light setups and art direct a lot faster using a third-party renderer like Redshift. So this is how you know if you're good at lighting or not, if you can get something without the lipstick on a pig and have materials and shiny materials, that you can make it look good with just lights. So not saying I'm great with lights or anything like that, but it's fine. It's fine. It passes for government work. So what we're gonna do is add some materials. Now we messed around with the lights. We know that lights aren't scary in Redshift. They work exactly the same as Cinema 4D lights, and it renders really fast. Now let's go to textures. Okay, so we can add a new texture either by going to the Redshift menu and going to Redshift material, or go down here and go to create Redshift material. Okay, so either or, I'm just going to create a default material here. And what I'm going to do is let's focus on this. Let's get this right there. And we're just going to drag and drop the material on there. And the default material is just a shiny plastic. And let's apply this to a few things here. Why not? Like that and that. We got a lot of plastic thing and plastic sphere, shiny sphere for Nick Campbell. Make him happy. And we're just gonna, so we got this bunch of shiny plastic all over the place. Okay. And what we're gonna do is just double click on this Redshift material, and oh my God, it's a node. It's okay. It's fine. It's fine. We're going to be fine. But basically, I'm just going to reposition this so you can see some of the shiny textures here. You're going to notice that, yes, there's nodes, but it looks like espresso, right? So if you're familiar with espresso and nodes and how they work there, you're going to feel right at home here. So we have the Redshift material and then just the output. It's going to get output to the surface of whatever object you're applying this to, right? So if I click on the Redshift material, you're going to see base properties, and this is where you're going to live most of the time. And you're going to see that all of these options, if I double click and create a C4D material, we got our color channel there. We got our backlight, which is basically like the backlight shader. Reflection, we got reflectance, you know, just boop. And the nice thing about Redshift is that it has Fresnel already enabled. On the C4D shader, you have to manually add that. We have subsurface scattering. That's a shader in Cinema 4D's material, and this is just really easy. Oh, renders so quickly. Refraction transmission, that's basically your transparency. Okay, so let's close that out. Let's delete that material, and let's start playing around. So we have the color. We can choose like a blue, and maybe turn down some of our lights here. Now we've got some of our textures here. Do that. Something like that. And we can adjust the weight, and that's basically just, you know, the strength of that color. You can adjust the roughness, so we can actually blur the actual diffuse to make it look like it has a rougher surface. And then we have our shiny reflection, and we can adjust this shine with the roughness. And this is kind of blowing out. Let's get a darker material so we can actually see some of this stuff. There we go. So this roughness, like that, boom, renders that quickly. It's really awesome. And one thing to know about samples and stuff like that is if you see graininess, you can actually control samples on individual options on a material. So if the samples, if this is too grainy, you can just up the samples and just keep testing this out and just up the samples on this reflection. So you're not globally changing it, but you can really optimize your scene by dialing in these samples on different options here. So we also have refraction. So if we adjust this weight, you can see that we're making this see-through, right? And you're going to see that this is really cool and blurred as well. And so just see how quick that renders there. And the reason why it's blurred already is that we have the blurriness linked, or the roughness linked to the reflection. So we can actually just control the actual roughness of the reflection and independently adjust the roughness of the refraction as well. You can add some dispersion to get some like really cool prism effects. It's really nice, like boom, really cool Instagrammable thing to get those dope likes. Thin wall is just basically like a thin pane of glass. You know, you can see right through it. Let's turn that off. And we'll cover the subsurface. Actually, let's do it right now. Let's do it right now. So I'm just going to close this. I'm just going to create a new material here. Or I can command, click, and drag to duplicate that. And what I'm going to do is just crank up the subsurface scattering. So I already have the refraction going on. I'm just going to adjust the absorption scale here, and let's choose a color for our subsurface scattering color. And you're going to see, ooh, we got this really cool blue. And then extinction is actually additive. Okay, so we can choose a color here. You can see that we have to choose a really dark color for it to even show up. And you're seeing that we're actually getting green here. Okay, so it's actually, you have to choose the opposite color. So if I wanted purple, I'd have to choose green, and then you'd see this purpley blue kind of showing up. Okay, so two modes. I like sticking with the transmittance. And then the cool thing is the scatter scale. And you can see that we blur this out and make this look like a really milky kind of object here, which is really nice. Let's up this light here. Looking really nice. And it renders super, super fast here too. So you can see if I bring the absorption scale down, we can make this really nice and bright. And that scatter, just like you could have so much fun just playing around with this. So subsurface scattering, all that to say, it's really, really easy. Now, outside of dialing in and creating these different materials, there's also all these presets. So we got glass, we got tinted glass, which also uses the subsurface there. Blur that a little bit. Boom. We have aluminum. I don't know why I'm saying we. I didn't make this. Redshift has aluminum. Blur that really quickly. It also has like color and edge tints, so you can choose different colors for the different parts of the Fresnel, which is really nice. But there's just to say, there's so many cool presets that you could just look at that. That's awesome. You could just have so much fun just with these presets and just building off of that, which is really, really cool stuff. So those are your like base materials. There's also coating if you want like an extra layer of plastic sheen on the top, a little coating of like a clear coat. And let's go back to our Redshift material that has the refraction. So it's the plastic material here. And let's go into the nodes and figure out, let's dispel the scariness about of nodes. So what I'm going to do is, we have this nice shiny material on here, but we all know that this is too perfect. We want to make this a little bit more imperfect. So what you typically do is you would load up some noise to break up the roughness of a material. So in Redshift, you would just go ahead and use the handy search function and just go, all right, let's do noise. You'll see that Maxon noise is a thing. And Maxon noise has all of the noises that you should be familiar with. So if we do, let's do booyah, because I always like saying booyah. And you can see that we have all the different octaves, some new options there. We have the animation, we have the overall scale, and your cycles, low clip, high clip, brightness, contrast, all that good stuff. So how do we get this noise to break up the roughness? Well, if I go to my Redshift material, you'll see that the roughness or the reflection is in the base properties, and it's in reflection, and there's roughness. So I got my out node, my output. So I want to output this noise and plug it into the Redshift material node. So the left part is the input. And I'll just go and you'll see, okay, base properties, reflection, roughness. All right, let's pipe it into that. And you'll see that now you can see the noise. If I go down to my noise again and adjust the overall scale, you can see that we're using the noise to break up and adjust the roughness value based on the black and white values that we have here. So we can change, maybe we have this be a little more gray, or maybe we have this be white. So you can see that we're having a little bit more frosted because we're inverting the noise. So it's looking a little bit more roughed up. I can maybe see what another noise looks like. Dense. Sure, why not? So this is really, really cool to be able to just blur out stuff like that. Now, if you wanted to use that same noise for, say, bump, we can easily do that as well. So let's go ahead and, just like we used a noise node to bring in noise, we need a bump node to add some bump. So there's my bump map. I'm just going to drag and drop this into our shader graph, and I'm just going to pump in the same noise as a texture. So I'll just choose texture input, and then we'll just output this bump map into the Redshift material input. And bump is in the overall, and you can say, boom, there's bump input, and there's the Redshift bump map. This is the height scale. So the more we increase this, the more bumpy, look at that. The more bumpy, that's super bumpy, the more bumpy it looks, okay? So that's bump, but if we actually wanted to, instead of, let's delete bump, let's do displacement. So to do displacement, we're just gonna type in displacement, and just like we did with noise, we'll bring in the displacement node, and we'll use the same Maxon noise. And this is kind of the cool thing about nodes, is that we can utilize the same noise and pump it into different things and not have to dig into different menus in a material, like a Cinema 4D material. So we'll go texture map, and we'll output out directly to the output, and that's where you'll find displacement. And you're not going to see anything right away, because if we want to add displacement and have it show up in our viewport, and render, we'll need to click on an object. I'm just going to hit S in my object manager to go straight to that object. So we need to apply a Redshift object tab, and we can do that by just right-clicking, going to Redshift tags, Redshift object. And if you go to geometry, this is where you can turn on displacement. So there's displacement right there. We'll just override. We'll choose enabled, and we can adjust this displacement, maximum displacement, displacement scale. So you can really crank that up. Let's do 50. Let's see what that looks like. And you can see what that looks like. So let's maybe add this to our cylinder. So I'll just command click and drag to add that displacement to all those other objects. And we'll up the maximum displacement as well. So it's basically like the powers of levels of strength that you can control here. Something like that. And you can see what that looks like, looking really cool. Now let's say instead of using Maxon noise for displacement, I can just click on that little string to detach it. I wanted to use like a tile shader, a Maxon tile shader, C4D tile shader. So for that, we'll just go to C4D shader, and I'll drag and drop that in there. So here's where we can just add a C4D shader. So I'll go, and you'll see this is the shader option menu that is in C4D materials. So we'll go to surfaces, tiles. Let's twirl down the shader here, and I'll just click and drag, and make these all white. Actually, I should have just made one white and click and drag, whatever. We'll go and just use lines, and we'll use these lines as a bump. So I'll just place that, and you see that you can't. And the reason for that is a C4D shader needs to be converted into a texture, Redshift texture, to be output and be recognized and converted so Redshift can see it. So we'll just do texture, and we'll drag and drop that in there. So we'll go texture to Redshift texture, and we'll just say general image texture, and then the out color will go into displacement. You'll see that now we can make that connection because it's been converted from a C4D shader to a Redshift texture. And we'll just do texture map, and now you'll see that we have the lines here. So we can go and bring down the scale here, and that'll update in there, and we got this really cool displacement coming from our C4D shader. So you can utilize all those familiar C4D shaders for whatever you want, as long as you convert them to a Redshift texture using the Redshift texture node, which is really cool. Now we can apply, I forgot some of the objects here. So you'll notice, and this is like one just random quick tip, but if you ever wanted to select something that's in front or behind another object, so I got this plastic object. Every time I go to click, if I want to grab that object right there that I haven't textured yet, there's an easy shortcut key to be able to select an object behind another object, and that's Command or Control, and you right click and you release your Command or Control key, and then you can actually select an object behind it. So I know that's volume mesher, and it's these two objects right here. So I'll just go ahead and just drag and drop these materials to those, and we got that texture there. And let's see, I got this one too. So I'll command and right click and grab this. I think it's the subdivision surface. Yep, right there. I should have named my objects. Shame on me. And I'll right click, apply. And now we have our scene completely textured here, which is nice. Now, if you wanted to go ahead and render, now I know this isn't the most amazing composition here. Let's actually pull back on the, let's remove that subsurface scattering altogether and the blurriness. Let's go ahead and go to render. And we're just going to make sure we choose the Redshift render. And here are the Redshift options. So here are your basic samples. So min and max, that's also in your physical renderer. If you go to physical, you have the min and max samples and all that good stuff. There's also global illumination. You can choose two types, primary and secondary. That's the same thing in Redshift. So we can go to GI and just turn on, actually I had them on the entire time. Look at me. So primary GI, we'll go to brute force, and this is like your Monte Carlo, and then a radius point cloud, which again, these are the same types that are same names as the physical renderer. And there you go. You can adjust the amount of bounces and all that good stuff. So if you're used to using GI in physical render, this should make sense. Go back to basic, and you can choose to up your min and max samples here. This also controls your anti-aliasing. And we have this adaptive threshold, which works similarly in physical render, like how much grain can you tolerate, basically. And if you want to control individual reflection, refraction, and AO, and all these different samples, you can go ahead and click override and just set your own amount of samples to override the unified sampling here. So a lot of control over samples, and you can get pretty geeky as far as how to optimize all that sample stuff to get the fastest render. But all that said, it's pretty easy to kind of use Redshift and get up and running. So let's just turn off this plastic. I'm just going to show you cameras. So we got to use a Redshift camera. We'll just look through it, and let's just adjust our focus there. And let's just quickly just show you how to use depth of field. So I got my Redshift camera. I'm going to click on my Redshift camera tag. And if we go to bokeh, we'll go to override and enable this. And the thing that's going to control the amount of depth of field blur is this circle of confusion radius here. And you can see as we enable that, we are blurring stuff out based on the focus point here that we're setting. That's pretty blurred out there. But this just renders really, really fast too. And I think we're coming to the point where, you don't have to do your motion blur in post anymore because of how fast this renders. So just one last thing, and that is a background. You see, we just have a black background, actually no background at all. So how do you create a background is not by using what you typically do with just grabbing a background object. What you'll need, and this also goes for, HDRIs and stuff like that, is a dome light. So a dome light is where you'd load up an HDRI image. You can see we're just like kind of blowing out the scene here, but you can also use a dome light for a background color. So if I choose, something like this, and you'll see that this is actually contributing to the light in the scene. So what we can do is just turn off effects diffuse and effects specular, and we can get a background. Let me actually just turn off this, turn off the bokeh so we can see the background there. So you can see that. And that's basically it. That's how you can add a background. So we can always, up the samples on everything and make this really nice, but that's a whole nother story. But hopefully this presentation has kind of helped you get over your fear of nodes and understand how great they are and how easy Redshift is to use and just how fast Redshift is as well. All right, so I think I've probably talked your ear off quite enough about Cinema 4D and Redshift, but I just want to say thank you so much to Matthias and Maxon and Paul Babb and Rick and the whole Maxon team for putting this whole thing together. It's really an honor to be a part of, along with all these other amazing artists that are presenting during this kind of tough time for everyone. So I'm glad that we can do this, even if it's online. And I just want to thank you for watching.